Imagine eating 3 pounds of meat every day and watching your body continue to waste down to the bones. You are not sick in any way you can identify. You have no fever, no wound, no visible injury. You are simply disappearing slowly and steadily, while consuming more food than the men around you who are gaining weight. You are not suffering from a mystery. You are feeding something. Something pale and blind and already 9 meters long that has been living inside your intestinal wall since that undercooked pork 2 months ago on the trail, anchored there by the double row of hooks it was born with, absorbing everything you eat before your body gets a chance to. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today you're going to discover why that rare steak cooked over a frontier campfire was a one-way ticket to being consumed alive from the inside out. The frontier's relationship with meat was not the relationship of a person with a choice. It was a relationship of a person with a caloric requirement and whatever was available to meet it. On the trail, in the cattle camps, in the homestead settlements, meat was the centerpiece of every meal, not because the frontier had developed a sophisticated culinary preference for it, but because meat was protein and fat, and the body running on the physical demands of frontier labor needed both in quantities that the available alternatives could not reliably provide. Beef, pork, game taken from whatever the surrounding territory offered, prepared by whoever in the camp or household had the tools and the time, over whatever fire the available fuel could sustain. The fire was a problem. Or rather, the fire was one of many problems, and it was the one that created the most intimate and long-lasting consequences. A proper cooking fire, one that sustains sufficient heat to bring the interior of a thick cut of meat to a temperature that kills the organisms living in it, requires time and fuel and the kind of attention that a traveling party moving 15 miles a day under time pressure did not consistently have available. The campfire assembled from whatever wood or dry dung the immediate vicinity offered, built after camp was made and the animals were tended and the day's problems were addressed, burning with a variable intensity of improvised construction, was not a reliable instrument of food safety. It was a heat source. Whether that heat source was sufficient to penetrate to the center of the meat resting over was a question that nobody in the camp had the tools to answer, and that the appearance of the meat's exterior provided no reliable information about. The interior of an undercooked piece of pork looks like cooked meat until you look at it carefully in poor lighting after a day of physical exhaustion, at which point it looks acceptable and you eat it because the alternative is not eating, and not eating is not an option. Taenia solium, the pork tapeworm, spends different stages of its life cycle in different hosts, and in the stage that enters a human being through consumption of infected pork, it arrives as a microscopic cyst embedded in muscle tissue. The cyst is not visible to the eye examining a cut of meat. It is not distinguishable by smell or texture or any sensory quality that a frontier cook could assess. It is simply present in meat that came from an infected animal, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to proceed to the next stage of its development. The conditions are exactly those provided by the human digestive system. Once the cyst passes through the stomach and enters the small intestine, it responds to the change in its chemical environment by activating. The organism inside the cyst, which has been dormant through the journey, extends itself and makes contact with the intestinal wall. The mechanism of attachment is not gentle and it is not temporary. The scolex, the head of the tapeworm, carries 2 concentric rings of hooks and 4 muscular suckers, and it uses all of them simultaneously to anchor itself to the intestinal wall with the commitment of an organism that has no intention of being dislodged. The hooks penetrate the tissue. The suckers create sustained negative pressure against the intestinal lining. The tapeworm is now a resident, and it is going to begin doing what it does. It does not eat in any sense that the word eat normally implies. It has no mouth. It has no digestive system. The tapeworm absorbs nutrients directly through its outer surface, the tegument, which is specifically adapted to pass nutrients from the intestinal environment of its host directly into the organism's own tissue. Every molecule of digestive food that the host's own intestinal wall is attempting to absorb passes first through an environment that the tapeworm is occupying, and the tapeworm takes its share before the host body receives what remains. The share it takes is not modest. It is the share of an organism that has no other nutritional source and whose entire biological imperative is growth. The growth is continuous and it is fast. A tapeworm established in the small intestine of a frontier pioneer was adding nearly 2 centimeters of length every day. not over the course of an illness that would eventually resolve. Every day, compounding, for as long as the host remained alive and continued eating. The 9-meter figure is not a medical curiosity. It is the documented length of specimens recovered from patients who have been hosting the organism for a sufficient period, and the 9 meters was contained entirely within the loops of the small intestine, coiled and folded through the abdominal cavity of a person who was walking and working and wondering why they could not stop losing weight no matter how much they consumed. The pioneer experiencing this did not experience it as a parasite infection because the concept of a parasite infection as a medical category was not the framework available to interpret the symptoms. He experienced it as a wasting that resisted explanation, the hunger that food could not satisfy, the fatigue that sleep could not address, the progressive thinning of the face and the limbs while the abdomen remained distended. These were symptoms that the frontier's limited medical vocabulary attributed to a range of causes: digestive weakness, poor constitution, bad air, the accumulated physical toll of hard living, all of which were present in sufficient quantity in the frontier environment to serve as plausible explanations for almost any symptom a person could present. The symptom that was unambiguous, the one that could not be attributed to bad air or digestive weakness, arrived periodically and without announcement. The tapeworm reproduces continuously during its residence in the host's intestine. It does this by producing proglottids, which are segments of its body, each containing a complete reproductive unit capable of generating thousands of eggs. These segments detach from the organism's posterior end as they mature and pass through the host digestive system, exiting with the stool. Each segment is approximately the size and approximate appearance of a flattened grain of rice when contracted, and it moves, not in the manner of a worm moving through soil, not with the vigorous propulsion of something pursuing a direction, but with the slow, continuous, determined muscular contraction of something alive and responding to its environment. A pioneer who discovered these in the outhouse, or who had no outhouse and discovered them in the immediate vicinity of the camp's latrine arrangements, had received information that the frontier's medical understanding was not entirely equipped to process, but that the body's instinctive response processed immediately and completely. The response was the same response that the frontier produced to most of its revelations: revulsion followed by the urgent practical question of what could be done about it. What could be done about it was limited and was not pleasant and was not reliably effective, and the frontier's medical practitioners approached the problem with a combination of genuine desire to help and genuinely inadequate tools that characterized their engagement with most of what the frontier produced. The treatment logic began with a theory about the tapeworm's relationship to its environment. The tapeworm was sustained by the host's nutritional intake. Therefore, denying the host's nutritional intake would weaken the tapeworm, reducing its hold on the intestinal wall and making it susceptible to expulsion. The patient was starved, not briefly and not gently, for days, on the theory that sufficient deprivation would bring the organism to a state of weakness from which it could be dislodged. What starvation of several days' duration did to a frontier pioneer who was already nutritionally compromised by months of inadequate diet and the continuous caloric extraction of a 9-meter intestinal resin was not limited to its effect on the tapeworm. It was felt comprehensively by the host's body, which had been running on insufficient reserves before the treatment began, and was now being asked to sustain itself on nothing while the physician waited for the parasite to weaken first. The weakening of the tapeworm, to whatever degree the starvation achieved it, was a signal to proceed to the next phase: turpentine, oil of male fern, pumpkin seed preparations, pomegranate root extract. The anthelmintic agents available to frontier medicine were not compounds designed with the precision of a modern pharmaceutical. They were substances that had demonstrated, through accumulated and largely empirical observation, some capacity to disturb the biological processes of intestinal parasites. They were administered in doses calibrated by experience rather than by any rigorous understanding of pharmacokinetics, to patients whose compromised state made their tolerance for additional chemical insult difficult to predict. The effect on the patient's digestive system was aggressive in a way that the word aggressive does not adequately describe. The substances that were toxic to the tapeworm were also, in the concentrations required to reach the parasite in the intestinal environment, toxic to the tissue of the patient's gastrointestinal tract. The cramping was severe. The body's response to the chemical assault was a full deployment of every expulsive mechanism available to it, and the patient spent the hours following administration in a state of sustained physiological emergency from which, in the best case, the tapeworm eventually emerged. The emergence was what everyone in the room was waiting for, and it was what no one in the room was fully prepared for regardless of how many times they had attended the procedure. The organism being expelled was alive. It had been alive inside the patient for months, and it was alive now, during the process of expulsion, responding to the conditions of its exit with the muscular activity of an organism that did not understand that it was being removed and was responding to its environment in the only way available to it. 9 meters of pale, ribbon-flat tissue exiting the patient in sections over course of an extended and agonizing period. Some of it arriving in the expected direction and some of it not. All of it moving. The physician's critical concern throughout this process was the scolex, the head, the anchored portion of the organism with its double ring of hooks and its 4 suckers still embedded in the intestinal wall. The body of the tapeworm could exit entirely, every meter of it. And if the scolex remained, the organism would begin the process of regeneration from that anchor point, and the 9 meters would be 9 meters again within weeks. The physician attending a tapeworm extraction had to account for the scolex, had to verify in the material that had been expelled that the head was present and intact and had made its exit along with the body, had to examine what the patient's body had produced and locate within it the specific structure that confirmed the extraction was complete. If the scolex was not present, the procedure was, in the most consequential sense, unfinished. The pioneer who had survived the starvation and the chemical treatment and the extraction process, and whose physician could confirm the presence of the scolex in the expelled material was, in the framework of frontier medicine, cured. The organism was gone. The nutritional competition it had been conducting against the host's own body was over. The process of genuine recovery could begin slowly, from a physiological baseline that months of parasitic drain and the treatment itself had left severely compromised. The pioneer whose physician could not confirm the scolex, who had endured everything the treatment required and arrived at his conclusion with the worst question still unanswered, had to wait. And in the waiting, had to consider the possibility that somewhere in the loops of his small intestine, something with hooks and suckers was already beginning to grow again. The frontier's most lethal threats announced themselves. The cholera came with speed, and the gunshot with noise, and the blacksmith's chair with the certainty of what was going to involve. The tapeworm announced nothing. It arrived silently in a meal that looked and smelled like food, established itself with no symptom that was identifiable in the moment, and proceeded to dismantle its host from the inside across a timeline measured in months, while the host continued working and eating and wondering why the work was harder than it used to be, and the eating was never quite enough. The predator that required no approach and left no tracks and could not be seen or heard or anticipated, only eventually discovered. Too late to prevent and difficult to remove, and always with the question of whether the removal had been complete. The Old West did not need to bare its teeth to take something from you. It needed only to offer you a plate of pork cooked over a fire that wasn't quite hot enough. In a world where nobody was required to tell you what was in the meat, and let biology manage everything after that. So tell us, the 9 meters of something alive inside the intestinal cavity, growing 2 centimeters every day, taking its portion of every meal before the body can reach it, or the cure, the days without food followed by the chemical assault followed by the extended process of expulsion, every moment of which was happening to a body that had already been through months of progressive depletion. Both of these are part of the same experience. You do not get to choose between them. You only get to choose which part you think about first. Leave it in the comments. And if the parasite inside the body represents the frontier's most intimate horror, consider the horrors that the frontier practitioners were visiting on the outside of the body with the tools available to them. The blacksmith's pliers on the infected tooth, the probe entering the gunshot wound, the saw arriving when the gangrene had made every other option unavailable. Click on our video about the frontier dentist. What happened in that chair was waiting for every pioneer who survived long enough to need it. Raw, visceral, history. This is the raw frontier.